It is March of 1966, and the Chicago Stadium is shaking, not figuratively. The old barn on West Madison Street is literally vibrating. The steel rafters, the concrete floor, the wooden seats, all of it trembling under the weight of 20,000 voices screaming in unison. The noise inside that building is unlike anything else in professional sports. They have measured it. They will measure it again. It is louder than a jet engine at close range. And tonight, the people inside do not care about their hearing. They care about the man with the golden hair streaking down the left wing, cradling the puck on a stick blade that bends in a way no stick blade is supposed to bend. Bobby Hull pulls back his arm. Every defender on the ice knows what is coming. Every goaltender in the league has had nightmares about this exact motion. The stick comes forward with a violence that seems impossible from a human body. The puck leaves the blade at a speed that will later be estimated at over 100 miles per hour. The goaltender does not move. He cannot. The net ripples, the red light ignites, and the Chicago Stadium, that ancient, sweating, furious cathedral of hockey, reaches a volume that people in the parking lot can feel in their chests. That goal is number 51. No player in the history of the National Hockey League has ever scored more than 50 goals in a single season before this night. The record had stood since Maurice Richard first touched it 2 decades earlier, and the hockey world had quietly accepted that 50 was the ceiling. That 50 was the boundary of what a human being could do on a sheet of ice with a rubber disc and a wooden stick. Bobby Hull did not accept that boundary. He shattered it, and he did it with a smile on his face, with golden hair flowing behind him, with a body built like a middleweight boxer who had somehow been taught to skate at the speed of sound. But there is more to this story than goals and records. There is a boy from a tiny dot on the map in Ontario who was doing a man's work on a farm before he was 10 years old. There is a player who terrified goalies so completely that some of them openly admitted they were afraid of his shot. There is a decision, one single, irreversible decision, that would make him the most controversial figure in hockey. A man who broke not just records but an entire league's grip on the sport. And there is a personal life that carried shadows the public rarely saw, complications that followed him long after the last goal was scored. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why Bobby Hull was not just another great player. You are going to understand why he was a force of nature, a man whose talent was so immense and whose choices were so seismic that professional hockey was never the same after he arrived. And you are going to understand why, decades later, there is still no consensus on exactly how to measure what the Golden Jet meant to the game he dominated. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let's begin. To understand what Bobby Hull did to the game, you first have to understand what the game was before he did it. And specifically, you have to understand what a forward was supposed to be, what the position meant, what it demanded, and what its unspoken limits were. In the early decades of the National Hockey League, the forward position, and particularly the left wing, was defined by a certain set of expectations. You skated hard, you hit people, you parked yourself in front of the net and tried to deflect pucks past a goaltender who wore almost no padding and had the temperament of a man who had been personally insulted by the existence of the rubber disc. Scoring was valued, of course, but it was not the primary identity of most forwards. Toughness was. Willingness to absorb punishment was. The ability to play through broken noses, fractured fingers, and cuts that would require stitches between periods. That was the currency of respect. The game in the 1940s and 50s was played in 6 arenas by 6 teams in front of crowds who knew every player's name, face, and home address. The original 6 era, Montreal, Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, Boston, and New York, was a closed ecosystem. There was no expansion. There was no dilution of talent. Every roster was stacked with players who in a larger league would have been stars. In a 6-team league, many of them rode the bench. The competition for roster spots was savage, and the competition on the ice was even worse. You played against the same 5 opponents over and over again, 70 games a season, and by February, The rivalries were not sporting, they were personal. In this world, the role of the left winger had a ceiling. Maurice Richard, the Rocket, had redefined what was possible for a right winger in Montreal, scoring 50 goals in 50 games during the 1944-45 season, a feat so extraordinary that people spoke about it the way they spoke about miracles. But Richard was an exception so extreme that he almost proved the rule. Nobody else approached 50. Nobody else even tried to think in those terms. The average left winger in the original Six era scored perhaps 15 to 20 goals in a good year. The great ones might touch 30, and the way they scored was direct, physical, and close to the net. You did not beat goaltenders with finesse from 40 feet out. You beat them by getting inside, by fighting through traffic, by being willing to take a stick across the wrists, to put the puck in a space the size of a dinner plate. The slap shot existed, technically. Players had been winding up and firing the puck with a full swing since at least the 1930s, but it was considered a desperation move. Inaccurate, slow to release, and easy for a goaltender to read. The wrist shot was the weapon of choice. The backhand was respected. The slap shot was a gimmick. Coaches discouraged it. Purists mocked it. And for a simple reason. Nobody had yet figured out how to make it lethal. The stick itself was part of the limitation. Hockey sticks in the 1950s were straight-bladed, made of solid wood and about as aerodynamic as a fence post. The blade was flat. The flex was minimal. When you shot the puck, it went where the laws of physics and the straightness of your blade dictated. There was no curve. There was no deception. A goaltender facing a straight blade knew, within a narrow margin, where the puck was going based on the angle of the blade at the moment of release. This made goaltending difficult but predictable, and it made scoring a matter of volume and placement, not velocity and chaos. Now consider the goaltenders themselves. Before Jacques Plante changed the position forever by donning a mask full-time in 1959, goaltenders faced every shot with their bare faces exposed. Think about that. A piece of vulcanized rubber traveling at 70-80, sometimes 90 miles per hour, aimed at a man whose face was protected by nothing but his own reflexes. This was not courage. It was insanity normalized by tradition, and it meant that forwards, however powerful their shots, operated within an unspoken agreement. You did not try to kill the goaltender. The game was violent, but it was not suicidal. Forwards aimed for corners, for the 5-hole between the pads, for the spaces around the body. The slap shot, wild, unpredictable, ferocious, was a violation of that agreement. It was the one weapon that made goaltenders genuinely afraid. This is the context into which Bobby Hull arrived. A 6-team league with rigid positional expectations, straight-bladed sticks, barefaced goaltenders, and a collective understanding that the left winger's job was to grind, hit, and score from close range. The idea that a forward could transform himself into a weapon of pure speed and power, that he could take a slap shot from the top of the face-off circle and beat a goaltender clean, not once, not 10 times, but 54 times in a single season, was not merely unlikely. It was unimaginable. The evolution Hull triggered was not just statistical, it was conceptual. Before Hull, the slap shot was a curiosity. After Hull, it was the most feared weapon in the sport. Before Hull, the curved stick blade was an accident, a warped piece of lumber that most players would have replaced. After Hull and his teammate Stan Mikita, the curve became the single most important innovation in offensive hockey equipment in the 20th century. The story goes that one of them, accounts differ on who, noticed that a stick with a bent blade produced shots that dipped, rose, and swerved unpredictably. Instead of discarding the damaged stick, they experimented. They bent blades intentionally. They heated them under doors, in hot water, over steam, and what they discovered was a revolution. A curved blade did not just change where the puck went. It changed what the puck did in the air. It turned the slap shot from a straight-line weapon into a missile that moved laterally, vertically, and with a kind of malicious unpredictability that reduced professional goaltenders to guesswork. The league eventually had to legislate the curve. By the late 1960s, blade curves had become so extreme, some bending as much as 1.5 inches, that goaltenders were lobbying for restrictions. The NHL introduced a maximum curve limit, reducing it over time to 0.5 inch. But the damage, if you could call it that, was done. The curved blade was permanent, the slap shot was permanent, and the template for a modern power forward, the player who combined speed, strength, and a devastating shot from distance, was permanently established. The man responsible for all of it stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 212 pounds of what appeared to be solid granite. Hull's body was the subject of genuine fascination during his playing career. His chest measured 44 inches around. His biceps were thick enough that teammates joked they belonged on a man twice his height. His thighs were so powerful that his skating stride generated speed that astonished players who had been in the league for years. He was clocked as the fastest skater in the NHL during multiple seasons, a distinction that is almost absurd when you consider that he was also one of the strongest players in the league. Speed and power rarely coexist at the highest level. In Hull, they coexisted so naturally that it seemed like a design flaw in the rest of humanity. There is a quote from Glenn Hall, the great Chicago goaltender who played alongside Hull for years and had the misfortune of facing him in practice, that captures the terror of Hull's shot. Hall, a man who played 502 consecutive games in net without a mask, a man whose pre-game routine famously involved vomiting from sheer nervous tension, said of Hull's slap shot that it arrived so fast that by the time you saw it, it was already past you. Hall was not prone to exaggeration. He was a man who had faced every great shooter of his era, and he spoke of Hull's shot the way a soldier speaks of artillery fire, with respect born from proximity to danger. The position of left wing would never be the same. After Hull, the expectation for a top-line winger shifted permanently. The prototype was no longer the grinding, close-range scorer. The prototype was the Hull model: speed to burn, a shot from the circles that could beat any goaltender alive, and the physical presence to survive the punishment that came with being the most dangerous man on the ice every night. Players like Guy Lafleur, Michel Goulet, Luc Robitaille, and eventually Alexander Ovechkin would all carry fragments of the template Hull created. Each of them would add their own dimensions, but the original blueprint, the left winger as a weapon of mass destruction, belonged to the Golden Jet. And all of that, the speed, the shot, the body, the innovation, came from a farm boy who grew up carrying hay bales and milking cows in a village so small it barely registered on a map. The distance between that farm and the roaring chaos of the Chicago Stadium is the first great story of Bobby Hull's life. And it is a story that begins in the cold. Robert Marvin Hull was born on the 3rd of January, 1939, in Pointe Anne, Ontario, a community so small that calling it a town would be generous. It sat near Belleville, on the shore of the Bay of Quinte, and its primary industries were cement and survival. The Hull family was large, working class, and built around physical labour. Bobby's father worked at the cement plant. The children worked everywhere else. By the time Bobby was 8 years old, he was hauling bales of hay, carrying milk pails, and performing manual labour that would have exhausted most adults. He did not have a gym membership. He did not have a personal trainer. He had a farm, a Canadian winter, and a pair of skates. The skating came first. Before he could read properly, before he understood what the NHL was, Bobby Hull could skate. The Bay of Quinte froze every winter, and the local kids would spend hours on the natural ice, playing pickup games with frozen horse droppings when pucks were unavailable. This is not mythology. This was Canadian childhood in the late 1940s. You played with what you had, and what Bobby Hull had, from the very beginning, was a physical gift so obvious that adults in the community noticed it before he reached double digits in age. His shot developed on the farm as much as on the ice. The act of swinging a heavy object, an axe, a pitchfork, a shovel, over and over, day after day, from childhood onward, built forearms and wrists of extraordinary density. Hull's wrist strength became legendary, but it was not the product of a training regimen. It was the product of a rural upbringing in which a boy's body was shaped by the demands of the land. When he picked up a hockey stick, the muscles that had been built swinging an axe translated directly into a wrist shot of terrifying power. And when he later developed his slap shot, those same forearms allowed him to generate flex and velocity that other players simply could not replicate. He moved through junior hockey with the subtlety of a freight train. By 16, he was playing for the St. Catherine's Teepees in the Ontario Hockey Association, and the reports that filtered back to NHL scouts were almost comically enthusiastic. He was fast. He was strong. He shot the puck harder than anyone they had seen at that age level, and he was, by all accounts, fearless, willing to drive to the net against defenders who outweighed him and had years of experience in the art of physical intimidation. The Chicago Blackhawks held his rights, and they brought him to the NHL at 18 years old for the 1957-58 season. Chicago in 1957 was not the glamorous franchise it would later become. The Blackhawks were, by most measures, the worst organization in the original six. They had not won a Stanley Cup since 1938. Their attendance was abysmal. Their roster was thin. The Chicago Stadium, for all its future glory, was half empty on most nights. The franchise was so desperate that there were genuine discussions about its viability. Into this situation walked a teenage farm boy with blonde hair and a shot that made grown men flinch. Hull's first season was modest by the standards he would later set. 47 points in 70 games. But the raw material was so evident that nobody in the organization questioned the investment. He was fast, breathtakingly fast. In an era when skating speed was valued but rarely measured with precision, Hull stood out to the naked eye. Opposing players described the experience of watching him accelerate down the left wing as disorienting. He seemed to reach top speed in fewer strides than anyone else, and his top speed was higher than anyone else's. It was not just fast skating. It was a different category of movement, and it gets harder to believe when you hear about the shot. Hull's Slapshot, which he developed and refined over his first few NHL seasons, was not merely powerful. It was unlike anything the league had experienced. He did not shoot the puck so much as launch it. The motion began with a full wind-up, the stick coming back past his waist, sometimes to the level of his ear, and ended with a forward explosion that transferred every ounce of his 200-plus pounds into a 6-ounce piece of vulcanized rubber. Goaltenders who faced him described the experience in terms that border on the supernatural. The puck did not travel in a straight line. It rose, it dipped, it curved. The banana blade on Hull's stick, that controversial, exaggerated curve, gave the puck a trajectory that was functionally unpredictable from the goaltender's perspective. You could guess, you could react, but you could not reliably track a projectile moving at over 100 miles per hour that was also changing direction in flight. The turning point for Hull, the moment he went from promising young player to the most exciting figure in the sport, came in the 1960-61 season. Chicago, which had been building quietly around Hull, goaltender Glenn Hall, and a collection of tough, skilled players, made an improbable run to the Stanley Cup. The Blackhawks had not won the championship in 23 years. The city had almost forgotten what hockey glory felt like. But in the spring of 1961, Hull and his teammates defeated the Montreal Canadiens in the semi-finals, ending Montreal's bid for a 6th consecutive cup, and then took down the Detroit Red Wings in 6 games to claim Stanley Cup. Hull was 22 years old. He had a championship, and he was just getting started. The wall came not from the ice but from the expectations that followed. After the cup win, Chicago became a destination. The stadium filled, the fans arrived, and the pressure to repeat mounted. Hull was the centerpiece, the face of the franchise, the man the marketing was built around, and opposing teams adjusted accordingly. The checking, the physical attention directed at Hull became relentless. Every team assigned its toughest defender to shadow him. Every game featured collisions, hooks, slashes, and holds designed to slow the fastest man in the league. Hull played through injuries that would have sidelined lesser competitors. He broke his nose multiple times. He played with cracked ribs, torn ligaments, and damaged knees. The physical toll of being the most targeted player in a 6-team league, a league where you face the same enforcers 14 times a season, was staggering. But Hull did not slow down. He accelerated. In 1961-62, he scored 50 goals, tying the record Maurice Richard had set 17 years earlier. The hockey world noticed. Then, in 1965-66, he did what no one had done. 54 goals, a new record. The ceiling that everyone had accepted as permanent was gone. Hull did not merely reach Richards' number. He passed it. He passed it with 4 games remaining in the season, as if the record were not a barrier but a suggestion. His teammate Stan Mikita once said of Hull that playing alongside him was like being in the slipstream of a comet. You could feel the energy. You could feel the attention he drew from every opponent on the ice. And in the spaces his speed and power created, everyone around him found room to operate. Hull was not just a goal scorer, he was a gravitational force, a player whose mere presence on the ice rearranged the geometry of the game. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. It was not the records or the trophies that defined Hull's relationship with the sport. It was a choice, a single, massive, irreversible choice that would split his career in two, fracture his relationship with the NHL establishment, and change the landscape of professional hockey forever. And that choice was still years away, waiting like a storm on the horizon. The first moment that belongs in any account of Bobby Hull's career is the 1961 Stanley Cup run. Not because it was his greatest individual performance, but because it was the foundation. Everything that followed was built on that spring. Chicago entered the 1961 playoffs as underdogs. Montreal had won the Stanley Cup 5 times in the previous 6 seasons, and the Canadiens were expected to continue their dominance without interruption. The Blackhawks had finished 3rd in the regular season standings. They were young, they were talented, but they had not proven anything in the postseason. The Canadiens, by contrast, had Jean Beliveau, Henri Richard, Dickie Moore, and a roster so deep that their 4th line would have started on most other teams. Montreal did not play the playoffs. They administered them. In the semi-final series, Chicago did something nobody anticipated. They attacked Montreal with a speed and physicality that disrupted the Canadiens' elegant systems. Hull was the tip of the spear. He drove the left wing with a fury that forced Montreal's defenders into reactive positions. Glenn Hall, in goal, was magnificent, stopping shot after shot with the tortured brilliance that defined his career. And in 6 games, the Blackhawks eliminated Montreal. The Canadiens' dynasty did not end with a whimper. It ended with Bobby Hull skating past their defenders like they were standing in wet cement. The finals against Detroit were almost anticlimactic by comparison. The Red Wings were a strong team, anchored by Gordie Howe and Alex Del Vecchio, but they could not match Chicago's momentum. The Blackhawks won the series in 6 games, and Hull, at 22, had a Stanley Cup ring. The city of Chicago, which had treated hockey as a secondary entertainment for 2 decades, suddenly cared. The stadium was full, the Golden Jet was a star, and the franchise was reborn. The second moment is the 54-goal season of 1965-66, and it requires you to understand just how untouchable Maurice Richards' record was considered. Richards scored 50 goals in 50 games during the 1944-45 season. That record was not viewed as a benchmark to be surpassed. It was viewed as a monument, something sacred, something that belonged to an era and a man so iconic that challenging it felt almost presumptuous. Players approached 50 and fell short. They scored 45, 47, 48, and each time, the record survived, and the hockey world exhaled as if the natural order had been preserved. Hull had tied the record with 50 in 61-62, but tying was not breaking, and for the next 4 seasons the question lingered, could he actually surpass it? The pressure was immense. Hull was not just chasing a number, he was chasing a ghost, and the ghost was a demigod in Montreal, a man whose legacy was protected by an entire province's sense of identity. To break Richards' record was to make a claim that many Canadians were not ready to accept, that someone might be greater than the Rocket. On March 25, 1966, against the New York Rangers at the Chicago Stadium, Hull scored his 51st goal. The building erupted. Fans threw hats, programs, debris, anything within reach. The game was stopped for several minutes while the ice was cleared. Hull stood at center ice, his helmet off, his blonde hair catching the arena lights, and absorbed the noise. He would finish that season with 54 goals, a number so far beyond what anyone else was doing that it existed in its own category. The next highest scorer in the league that year had 35. Hull did not just break the record, He obliterated the concept that it was a limit. The numbers are striking when you place them in context. In a league with 6 teams and no expansion dilution, where every goaltender was an elite professional and every defender knew your tendencies from years of repetition, Bobby Hull scored 54 goals. The difficulty of that achievement in a 6-team league cannot be overstated. There were no weak opponents. There were no expansion teams filling rosters with minor leaguers. Every single night was a test against the best the sport had to offer. He would break his own record again in 1968-69, scoring 58 goals in 76 games. That number would stand as the left-wing record for years, and the manner in which he scored, the blinding speed down the wing, the terrifying wind-up, the shot that goalies could hear before they saw, became the defining image of an era. The third moment is the one that fractured everything. In 1972, the World Hockey Association was formed as a rival league to the NHL. It was brash, underfunded, and desperate for legitimacy, and it had one weapon that the NHL could not counter with tradition or prestige: money. The Winnipeg Jets of the WHA offered Bobby Hull a contract worth $2.75 million over 10 years. At the time, Hull was making approximately $100,000 per season with the Blackhawks. The WAA offer was not just generous, it was transformative. It was the kind of number that made players reconsider everything they had assumed about loyalty, tradition, and the power dynamics of professional sports. Hull signed, and the hockey world split open. The NHL reacted with fury. The league's establishment viewed Hull's departure as a betrayal, not just of Chicago, but of the institution itself. The NHL attempted legal action to prevent WHA players from competing. Hull was banned from international competition, excluded from the 1972 Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union, a series that many considered the most important hockey event of the century. The exclusion was deliberate, it was punitive, and it was deeply felt by Hull, who wanted desperately to represent his country against the Soviets, but was denied because he had committed the unforgivable sin of choosing a rival league. The impact of Hull's jump to the WHA cannot be measured in goals or assists. It changed the economics of professional hockey permanently. Before Hull, NHL owners had near total control over player salaries. The reserve clause bound players to their teams with minimal negotiating leverage. The existence of the WAA, and specifically the existence of Bobby Hull in the WAA, forced the NHL to compete for talent on financial terms. Salaries across the league rose dramatically. Players suddenly had options. The power balance between owners and athletes shifted in a way that would never fully reverse. In Winnipeg, Hull was magnificent. He scored 77 goals in the 1974-75 WHA season, a number that is almost impossible to process. 77 goals in a single season. Yes, the competition level in the WHA was uneven. Yes, some of the goaltending was inferior to NHL standard. But 77 goals is 77 goals. You still have to shoot the puck. You still have to beat the man in the net. And Hull did it with the same breathtaking combination of speed and power that had defined his NHL career. He won 2 Avco Cups with the Jets, the WHA's equivalent of the Stanley Cup, and became the face of the rival league. His presence gave the WHA credibility it could not have earned otherwise. When people dismissed the WHA as a minor league masquerading as a major one, the response was simple: Bobby Hull plays there. If it is good enough for the Golden Jet, it is not a joke. The fourth moment is the toll. By the mid-1970s, Hull's body was beginning to pay the price of 2 decades of professional hockey played at maximum velocity and maximum violence. His knees were damaged. His nose had been broken more times than he could accurately count. Estimates range from 10 to 14 fractures over his career. He had lost teeth. He had played through separated shoulders, cracked ribs, and deep lacerations that were stitched between periods and reopened during the next shift. The physicality of his era, an era without helmets for most of his career, without visors, without the injury protocols that modern players take for granted, had left its mark on every joint, every bone, every inch of his body. But Hull continued to play, he continued to score, and he continued to draw crowds in Winnipeg with the same magnetic charisma that had filled the Chicago Stadium. There was something about watching Bobby Hull play hockey that transcended the box score. It was the way he moved, the explosive acceleration, the way he leaned into his crossovers, the way his body seemed to be in perfect harmony with the ice beneath him. He was beautiful to watch. In a sport defined by collisions and chaos, Hull offered moments of pure athletic grace that made you forget the violence and simply appreciate the movement. The fifth moment belongs to the return and the twilight. When the WHA merged with the NHL in 1979, the Winnipeg Jets were one of 4 WHA teams absorbed into the established league. Hull, now 40 years old, played briefly for the Jets in the NHL and then finished his career with a short stint on the Hartford Whalers. He scored 2 goals and 2 assists in 9 games for Hartford before retiring. It was an unceremonious ending for a career that had been defined by spectacle. No farewell tour, no standing ovations in every arena. The NHL had never fully forgiven him for leaving, and the quiet end of his playing days reflected that institutional resentment. But the record speaks regardless of how it ended. In his NHL career, Hull scored 610 goals and added 560 assists for 1,170 points in 1,063 games. In the WHA, he added another 303 goals and 335 assists in 411 games. Combined across both leagues, his professional goal total exceeded 900 goals, scored against professional goaltenders, with a curved stick and a slap shot that changed the fundamental understanding of what a forward could do. When Gordie Howe was asked about Hull's shot, he gave an answer that captured the experience better than any statistic could. Howe, who was not easily impressed by anyone or anything, said that Hull's slap shot was the hardest he had ever seen, and that facing it was an experience he would not wish on anyone. That is Gordie Howe, a man who played professional hockey across 5 decades, a man who fought, scored, and dominated longer than any human being before or since. And he looked at Bobby Hull's shot and shook his head. But away from the ice, away from the roar and the records, there was a quieter story, one that the cameras rarely showed. And it is a story that must be told with honesty, because honesty is the only thing that makes the celebration of greatness meaningful. Bobby Hull's personal life carried complications that cast long shadows over his legacy. His marriages were marked by allegations of domestic abuse, claims made publicly by his first wife Joanne, and later supported by accounts from others close to the family. These allegations were serious, they were painful, and they became part of the public record in ways that Hull could not escape and that the hockey world struggled to reconcile with the image of the smiling, charismatic superstar who signed autographs for children and charmed reporters with his easy confidence. This is not a story that resolves neatly. The Hull who played hockey with such joy and ferocity was the same Hull whose private conduct raised deeply troubling questions. The sport has grappled with this tension, not just with Hull, but with other figures whose on-ice greatness coexisted with off-ice behavior that cannot be excused or minimized. In Hull's case, the allegations led to real consequences. The Chicago Blackhawks in later years distanced themselves from some public celebrations of his legacy. His status as an ambassador for the franchise became complicated. The conversation about his place in the sport's history became, necessarily, a conversation about what we choose to honor and what we choose to acknowledge. Let that sink in. A man who was once the most popular player in the National Hockey League, a man who filled arenas and changed the sport's economics, became a figure whose legacy required careful, uncomfortable context. The golden image tarnished, not because of anything that happened on the ice, but because of what happened when the lights went off and the arena doors closed. The physical cost of his career was its own burden. Hull played in an era without helmets for most of his career. He was one of the last prominent players to resist wearing one. The damage to his body was cumulative and severe. The broken noses, the missing teeth, the knee surgeries, the chronic pain that followed him into retirement and never fully released its grip. He spoke about this openly in later years, describing mornings when getting out of bed required a negotiation between his will and his joints. The body that had been a marvel of athletic engineering, the body that had generated the fastest slap shot in the world, became a daily reminder of the price it had paid. And then there was the exile. Hull's decision to jump to the WHA had consequences that extended far beyond his bank account. He was excluded from the 1972 Summit Series, the Canada-Soviet showdown that became the most mythologized hockey event of the 20th century. Hull wanted to play. He begged to play. Paul Henderson scored the goal that won the series for Canada, and it became the most famous moment in Canadian hockey history. Hull watched from the outside. He watched his countrymen celebrate a victory he could not share in a series he could not join, because he had chosen to play for a different league. The bitterness of that exclusion never fully faded. Let that sink in. The greatest Canadian-born left-winger of his generation was not allowed to represent Canada in the most important hockey series ever played. Not because he lacked the talent, not because he was injured, but because he had exercised his right to sign with a team that offered him a fair wage. The NHL's power structure punished him for daring to suggest that players deserved a choice. And while history has largely vindicated Hull's decision, the WHA's existence improved conditions for every professional hockey player who came after. The personal cost of that vindication was borne by Hull alone, in real time, without the comfort of knowing that future generations would understand what he had done. His relationship with Chicago was complex until the end. He loved the city, he loved the stadium. He spoke about the noise, the fans, the energy of Madison Street with a warmth that was unmistakable. But the Blackhawks organization, hurt by his departure, resentful of the precedent it set, kept him at a distance for years. The reconciliation came slowly, in stages, and was never entirely complete. Hull would return for ceremonies, for alumni games, for moments of public celebration, but there was always an unspoken tension beneath the smiles. He had left, and in the world of professional sports, leaving is the one sin that is never fully forgiven. In retirement, Hull lived in various places, including a cattle farm, returning, in a sense, to the agricultural roots that had built his body in the first place. He remained a public figure, appearing at card shows, charity events, and hockey gatherings where fans who remembered the 1960s and 70s would line up to shake the hand that had held the most terrifying stick in the sport. He was generous with his time, he was warm with strangers, and he carried always the complicated weight of a life that contained both extraordinary achievement and undeniable failure. His son Brett Hull became one of the greatest goal scorers in NHL history, finishing with 741 career goals. The relationship between father and son was, by many accounts, strained for periods. Brett was raised primarily by his mother Joanne after the marriage ended. He built his own career, his own legacy, his own relationship with the sport. But the comparisons were inevitable, and the Hull name, for all its glory and all its complications, remained one of the most significant surnames in hockey history. Bobby Hull passed away on January 30th, 2023. He was 84 years old. The tributes that followed were warm but measured, reflective of a hockey world that had learned to hold two truths simultaneously. He was one of the most electrifying players ever to lace up skates, and he was a man whose personal life contained chapters that could not be celebrated. Both of these things were true. Both of them mattered, and the tension between them was, in the end, the most human thing about him. When you step back and look at the full arc of Bobby Hull's life, from the frozen bay in Pointe Anne, to the roaring madness of the Chicago Stadium, to the exile in Winnipeg, to the quiet farm in retirement, what you see is not a simple story of athletic greatness. It is a story about what happens when extraordinary physical talent collides with the forces of commerce, tradition, ego, and human frailty. Hull changed hockey. That is not an opinion. It is a measurable fact. He changed how the game was played by making the slap shot the most feared weapon in the sport. He changed how sticks were made by proving that a curved blade could turn a shot into something ungovernable. He changed how players were compensated by having the courage, or the audacity, depending on your perspective, to walk away from the only league that existed and prove that the market could bear competition. Every player who has ever negotiated a contract in professional hockey owes a debt to the man who proved that owners were not the only ones with leverage. And yet the legacy is fractured. The personal allegations cannot be separated from the public achievements, no matter how much the nostalgic part of us might wish otherwise. Hull's name is on the Stanley Cup. His number, 9, hangs in the rafters of the United Center in Chicago, the arena that replaced the old stadium. His statue stands outside, but the conversations that surround these honors have changed over time, becoming more nuanced, more cautious, more willing to acknowledge that greatness on the ice does not guarantee goodness off it. The era he represented, the original six giving way to expansion, the closed shop giving way to competition, the old world paternalism of team owners giving way to something approaching a free market, was one of the most transformative periods in the sport's history. Hull was not the only agent of that transformation, but he was its most visible symbol. When the Golden Jet left Chicago for Winnipeg, he did not just change teams. He changed the sport's understanding of itself. There is a photograph of Hull from the mid-1960s that captures something essential. He is skating down the left wing, stick back, ready to shoot, and his hair is streaming behind him like a flag. The ice is white. The crowd is a blur of dark shapes. And Hull is the only thing in the frame that is in perfect focus, a man in motion, frozen in time, doing the thing he was born to do. That image is hockey. Not the rules, not the statistics, not the business. The image of a man moving across the ice with a puck on his stick and the entire arena holding its breath. So how good was Bobby Hull, actually? He was the player who made goalies flinch. He was the left winger who scored 54 goals in a 6-team league where there was nowhere to hide and no weak opponent to pad your numbers against. He was the man whose slapshot was measured at speeds that professional athletes could not react to, a shot so fast and so unpredictable that it did not merely beat goaltenders, it erased them from the equation. He was the fastest skater in the NHL for the better part of a decade, and he was one of the strongest players on the ice at the same time. Speed and power, the combination that should not exist in one body, but did. He was the man who broke Maurice Richards' record when the entire hockey-watching world believed that record was permanent. He was the man who scored over 900 professional goals across 2 leagues and 2 decades. He was the man who walked away from the only league that mattered and, in doing so, forced the sport to reckon with its own economics. He was the man who made the Winnipeg Jets a legitimate franchise and gave the World Hockey Association the credibility it needed to survive long enough to change everything. He was also a man whose personal life contained pain he caused and pain he endured. The legacy is not clean. It never was. But the question on the table tonight was not whether Bobby Hull was a perfect human being. The question was how good he was on the ice. And the answer is, he was devastating. He was transformative. He was the kind of player who comes along once in a generation and leaves the sport permanently different from how he found it. The old Chicago Stadium is gone now. They tore it down in 1995. The noise that once shook its rafters exists only in memory and in the stories of those who were there. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The roar that built every time number 9 touched the puck, every time he crossed the blue line and pulled back that stick, every time 20,000 people leaned forward in their seats because they absolutely knew, that something was about to happen that they would never forget. The names on the cup fade over time, the metal wears, the engraving softens, but some names cut deeper than others. Bobby Hull, the Golden Jet, he was not perfect. But on the ice, with the puck on his stick, and the crowd on its feet, and the goaltender praying for mercy, he was as close to perfect as the sport has ever produced. The arena is empty now. The ice is still. But if you listen carefully, past the silence, past the years, you can still hear the sound. A stick striking a puck, a crowd rising, and a man with golden hair flying,